Thank you, everyone, for joining us again. I'm going to turn it over to Don Williams. Don, you have it.
Oh, thank you, Scott. Appreciate it. Well, listen, I just also want to start out by just thanking the Delta Interfaith Task Force. They have been really good to work with these past few months, and looking forward to working with them. Well, and of course, the East Carroll Parish community at large. So just my idea today is to guide you through what would be a planning process. And the planning process is in fact going to vary between different communities. In my experience over the decades, communities may have similar problems, but often, perhaps all the time, the actual solution, implementation, and time frame for each community is quite different. And the planning process is going to be directed towards your particular community and your particular goals. Next slide, please. Next slide as well. Thank you. So we like to think of planning in a variety of stages, and each stage is what we like to call a planning roadmap. And when you go online to NTIA resources, you'll see some toolkits that are about broadband planning efforts. And those things are also very useful. You can download them and review them just as well as you can this slide deck when we're done here. Each stage plays a pretty different role, and when they're combined, they really do help communities think through key aspects of any of their broadband initiatives. When possible, it's good to have communities work through these things in the general order that we're presenting them in. Now, sometimes that doesn't work for every community. Some communities have had a standing broadband committee for a number of years. Now, so those communities, they already have that done. Other communities have to start setting that up. You folks have got the Delta Interfaith Task Force, who so far is leading the way. And we're going to talk more about broadband champions and leaders as we go through this presentation. So the broadband planning does take quite a bit of effort. It takes quite a bit of analysis of various levels of what it is you're trying to accomplish, what your resources are, what your financial situation is. We're going to talk about each one of those as well. Next slide, please. So one of the things that's important to remember is that broadband planning does involve the vision thing. You have to have a vision, which is hopefully reflective of the stakeholders in the community. And I don't mean a vision just for next week or the next month or 2 or 3 years from now, but a vision of where broadband fits in this case, to the East Carroll Parish development effort going forward. People think that broadband systems last forever. Well, in fact, fiber systems are fairly going to last for a very long time, but every single network requires planning throughout. So it isn't that the initial plan is the final plan, and it isn't even after the network is implemented, there's still planning to do. And part of that is because broadband technology relies on innovation. And broadband technology companies have been very innovative over the last 20 years, as I'm sure you all recognize. We also want to make certain that the anticipated benefits of the program match what the key stakeholders in the community desire to see. The broadband planning should look at opportunities for partnerships. It should look at opportunities for how it can affect economic development in your community. And I'll say this now, I do a lot of economic development work in conjunction with EDA, USDA, and just regional groups, cities, counties. Without a good broadband, it's really hard to do economic development work these days. when you're trying to put together packages for workforce development, when you're trying to recruit companies to your area, when you have companies that want to expand where they are in your area, without broadband, it becomes extremely difficult. So I often think of broadband networks as economic development tools that are vitally important for rural America. Because without them, rural America is not going to have telehealth, they're not going to have distance learning, and they're not going to have good economic development. Next slide, please. Well, so here are our nifty 6 steps. One is to assemble a team and develop a broadband vision. We're going to talk about that team and how you establish a broadband vision, because that involves bringing people in who are stakeholders in the community. Secondly, we want to know who your local broadband providers are. It's good to chat with them. It's good to talk with them. It's perhaps the case that they have some plan to expand. It is also perhaps the case they don't have any plan to expand or upgrade their system, but it's good to establish a relationship with them so that you know what it is they're doing and can react to that where there are gaps between what they're going to do and what your community needs. Next, you have to assess broadband needs and what the state plan is, if there is one, and what the local and regional plans are. Sometimes states will have broadband plans, sometimes not. It's good to also familiarize yourself with state statutes about what can occur for public entities in providing broadband. Some states are very restrictive on what public entities can do. Some states are restrictive on what rural electric co-ops can do. So it's good to familiarize yourself with what is allowed and what is currently not allowed by state law. Perhaps the most important thing is to engage stakeholders in your community. And I know during the beginning of this session today, there are a number of important stakeholders on the line. Stakeholders are going to be involved throughout the process because we need to ascertain what their needs are, what their goals are currently, and what they see for future needs and future goals. Fifth, we need to evaluate the technology options. As Scott said, you know, I work all over the country. Fiber is definitely the gold standard. There are places where fixed wireless is going to be the solution. So I don't ever like to start a broadband project by announcing this is the technology we're going to use. That's probably not the best way to approach it. Some communities do. I like to look at all the technology options that there are and match that to what the community's resources, expectations, and needs are going forward. Finally, equally important is to assess the organizational models that are possible for how the network is to be operated, run, and financed. So we're going to take each one of these steps in turn. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
Great. So assembling the team. As I said, we already have a task force assembled. One of the things that I like to see in task forces are that there's a mix of skills in the task force and varying backgrounds and varying viewpoints on what the community looks forward to for economic development going forward and what the skill sets are of the various team members. I think it's also important that all the team members, whatever their viewpoints and skill sets, generally have an interest in a common goal, which in this case is improving broadband in the parish. Teams can include individuals with experience in telecommunications, information technology, finance, marketing, business, and importantly, people in the community who have resided there for a while, are members of voluntary organizations, and who really have a pretty good gut feel for what the community needs going forward. Because, you know, the team is going to have to look at analytic frameworks for what the system is going to look like and how it's going to get there. Sometimes, if a community is quite large enough, there'll be various task forces within the task force, perhaps one dealing with e-government, perhaps another dealing with economic development interests of regional economic authorities. Some for school systems, set up a task force for the school system. So these are all options, and they're all options depending on how the community wishes to proceed. Next slide, please. Well, strong partnerships are pretty important, and personnel resources are vital. Sometimes these are problems in rural America. Give you just a brief example. You know, a lot of times there are wonderful grant programs out there at the federal level, some at the state level. A lot of times in rural America, the community doesn't really have experience in grant writing. So, you know, when they go to apply for a grant, grants are very competitive. Sometimes it doesn't work out, not because they don't need it, but because they haven't turned in a good grant application. And that's part of working on planning and forming a team. Now, funding is important. I like to think of funding as something you start thinking about right away. Because funding and the kind of network you're going to build or have built for you, or have a provider build for you, depends on funding. And there's a lot of varieties of funding mechanisms out there. We're going to talk about some of them very briefly today, but in a future session, we're really going to focus on funding. And we have some great presenters here from USDA and EDA who will be in future meetings with us. Resources. Every community has resources that they may not think are related to broadband. My guess is when we look at these asset inventories, you're going to say, oh yeah, actually we do have some of these resources that can defray the cost of deploying broadband. And we need to make certain that the personnel we have for IT departments in the government or the school system, you know, get involved in the broadband planning process, because those folks may in fact be, you know, your key technological information sources. Next slide, please. So, communities can use these objectives to shape their vision and their planning effort, depending on what your vision is. Some communities are going to look at this and go, we want it all, and that's perfectly fine. Because economic growth, that's going to involve getting relationships with your government reps, development organizations, providers, business leaders. Sometimes a community will say, you know, we're not that interested in residential, but we really want to see more institutional connectivity, the hospitals, universities, and businesses. Still others are going to go, listen, our main goal right away is education. We have a homework gap. The schools may have connectivity, but our children, when they go home, they don't. So they have to go out in a car that night and go to a McDonald's or go to some place that has a hotspot and do the homework there or in their car. And that happens far too frequently throughout rural America. Finally, there's also the idea of expanded e-government. E-government makes governments more efficient, more transparent, and once there's a good e-government program going on, residents in that community have a higher opinion of that government because it's easier to interact with, there's more services online, and that makes everything easier for everyone. Next slide, please. So.
Sorry.
No worries. Thank you, Laura, no problem. So broadband is just critical to growth. Scott talked about some of these issues. You know, this table goes and kind of lays out the general ideas behind each one. There are many studies that are academic studies, studies by economic development groups, and what they will do is they will look at the broadband connectivity in an area and say, wow, with broadband, this economic development activity has radically picked up. That involves from selling your house to increasing revenue in a business. Some studies have suggested that medium-sized businesses can get up to $300,000 to $450,000 per year in revenue with enhanced broadband connectivity. That doesn't mean that every business is going to be able to do that, but that some can do that. And again, it's really important to acknowledge that without broadband, rural communities are going to continue to lag behind. And lagging behind sometimes means population decline. And that gets pretty hard to stop. So what this parish is doing is vitally important to its future, in my opinion. Next slide, please. Great. So assess your valuable resources. So this next set of slides is looking at asset inventories. And there are a variety of asset inventories that we're going to look at. Next slide, let's start there. Okay, so broadband planning inventories. First step, inventory of the physical facilities and community resources, both public and private, that are available to support broadband deployment. The second one we're going to look at is an inventory of projects and processes that could facilitate lower costs for deployment. Remember, the main thing about the asset inventories is, number one, to realize what your community has and what it doesn't have, but also to think about how you can, as a community, defray the cost of deployment for broadband. Those things are vital to a private sector person, and they're also vital to a community that's going to put in their own project. Next, inventory of land and spaces, inventory of service sectors, and importantly, an inventory of personal commuter centers and adoption programs. Let me say this to start about the adoption programs. It's one thing for a community to have a good broadband network, but if people don't sign up for it, do not have good digital literacy skills, it's helpful, but we need to educate people in every community how to use it. Don't be afraid of it, what the benefits are for you as a household. And those are adoption and digital literacy issues. And digital equity is extremely important going forward for economic development. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are some of the community assets if you're deploying a fiber system that you can look at. What all of these things have in common is they defray the cost of deployment. So if you've got abandoned water mains, streetlight conduit that has space, abandoned gas lines, telecommunication routes with conduit, that greatly decreases the cost of deploying fiber optics. Some of the communities are not going to have any of these. Others are going to have some, or some of almost all of them. So that's part of what the broadband task force in planning looks at. Next slide, please. Again, this is a wireless inventory. So one of the things that this inventory points out is that if you've got tall structures in your community, they can be used to replace the cost of putting up towers. Towers are expensive, many more expensive than others, depending on their height, what their wind capacity is, storm resistance, and space for antennas. But all of these need to be looked at as part of your community's inventory. In this case, where are these things in the parish? And let's put them on a map so we know where they are. And when we're doing our broadband planning going forward, we already have this information and it's on a map and it's available. Next slide, please. Okay, I love this part because, again, I'm into reducing the cost of broadband deployment wherever possible. Now, as many of you already know, the main cost of deploying fiber, if it's underground, is the cost of digging it up, right? The fiber itself, not to worry about that cost. The cost for construction is the labor cost of digging up the earth, digging through concrete, digging through roads, and hopefully not digging through rock. But we're going to talk about how to find that out in a little bit of time. The other one is align the project if you can. Find out where they're going to be building new roads, where they're going to be doing resurfacing, where they're going to be putting in new water pipes, and coordinate those kinds of digs with deployment of at least conduit. Because once the conduit is in, fiber optics is pretty easy to blow through the conduit. We'll talk about those in more detail in a future session. Streamline the local permitting process. So if the parish decides that what we really want to do is have a private provider come in, or a private provider that is there expand, one of the things you want to look at is improving the permit process. For a provider, that means they would like to know for certain when the permit's going to get approved. Every time a permit is delayed, it costs the construction company money. It makes the network more expensive to build. So that's what we also want to do there. Streetlight poles. Well, you all know about 5G. 5G is going to need a lot of poles, that's for sure. And to the extent that you have poles, let's get a feel for who owns those poles throughout the parish. Most of them are going to be from a telephone company or an electric company. Perhaps we'll find some poles that are owned by a municipality or a co-op. Next slide, please. Okay, so community inventories for land and space. This is perhaps one of the more useful ones for providers, no matter who the provider is, public or private. Every network is going to require land for a node, and Scott showed you where those nodes were on a map, and also for a NOC, a network operating center. Network operating centers can be pretty large. So we're going to want to be able to find where there are parcels of land available at low or no cost, and that might be part of what the community brings to the table in a public-private partnership. We'll talk about those in a little while as well. But for now, you have to bring things to the table in a public-private partnership. That's the partnership part. Existing wireless sites. Again, we need to know where the current towers are and where some substitute towers are that could be used. Also, space for Wi-Fi access points. Wi-Fi access points, hotspots, are very, very useful throughout the community. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the other things I like to make certain is when we're in our planning process, let's get a good feel, because at some point, the communities might issue a request for information. They might issue a request for proposal to a provider or to a selected group of providers, or just put them out and see who responds. But one of the nice things to have in that kind of proposal package is business license data by industry code. These things can be found online. What is the current land use plan? And what's the circulation element? That means transportation area. Is there plans for improving it? Is there a regional airport in the works? Where are city, state, and federal facilities? Because those might be, well, anchor institutions to a network. And by anchor institutions, I mean a couple of things. One, it's going to demand a high amount of bandwidth, and it's going to demand low latency. And for that, those institutions get to pay, right? And we need to make certain, we'll do this in a business session later, that the network you build has good revenue streams going into it. Similarly, with education buildings and campuses, medical facilities. And we also want to look at some of the strategies that economic developers are already using in your community. Is that a business improvement district? Is that a tax increment finance district? Are there subsidies going in for industrial parks? And who is now in the industrial park and who services them? Next slide, please. Engaging stakeholders. Scott talked about this very well. I'm going to talk about it a bit as well, because the stakeholders in a community are the ones that are going to have a vested interest in this network. going forward and into the future. So we want to strengthen the relationships we have with stakeholders. We want to seek areas of agreement with stakeholders. And we also want to reach out to stakeholders we really didn't know were stakeholders. And part of that is this sharing a vision, discuss the assessment findings. Let's talk a little bit about the assessment findings. So there are a number of ways to assess what a community needs. Some of those are called institutional surveys. They can be done by paper, they can be done in person. You can do consumer surveys, you can do computer surveys, you can have meetings throughout the community. A number of areas I work in, they basically go around to every community and have a meeting. They listen, they hear what that community wants, and then the county or parish says, okay, some of these communities have this already, these other communities do not. And we want to focus on those communities that do not, but we also want to involve the communities that do. Because in research, it appears that if you expand rural broadband where it isn't, areas that have broadband nearby benefit quite a bit. So it isn't the case that a community that has broadband says, oh, it doesn't help us to go rural broadband. In fact, it does, and there's data to prove that. Next slide, please. Okay, community leaders can make stakeholding a critical part of ongoing broadband efforts. So we've got local officials, state officials. Those are key people at the beginning of the process. We want to involve them to know that this parish is working on it at a grassroots level. And that's important for state and local officials to understand. It's also very important to reach out to the business community, whether those are Chamber of Commerce's, the Rotary clubs, civic organizations, as well as your local service providers, which we talked about a bit before. And eventually, the network should be complete, and it would reach community organizations, and if it's a residential network, it would also reach individual citizens. It's really important for the task force to make sure we have a good buy-in, and that's a buy-in from the community to the plan. A couple of ways to get that done. Number one, meet and listen to them and take their views into your plan. Second thing is needed is two-way communication. Two-way communication between the task force and stakeholders and the community at large. Finally, transparency. You know, transparency of planning for broadband networks is vital in communities. It can't be sort of, oh, here we are, we're planning, and oh, suddenly we have a plan. You need to be transparent about the planning process, what's gone into it, who's been talked to. All of these things help the planning process to be successful. I've looked at a number of communities, and I said, hey, have you had a planning effort before? Some of them say, oh yeah, we have. You say, well, what happened? And they go, yeah, you know, we just didn't get buy-in. I go, okay, let's make sure that doesn't happen this next time. So you can also learn from past mistakes. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we go. Building a broadband team. Now, part of the broadband team is going to be made up of what we like to call broadband champions. Now, broadband champions are not superheroes, but broadband champions are those folks in the community that never stop pushing for better broadband. If there's a meeting, they're showing up. If there's an opportunity to speak, they're going to speak. And that's vital. Champions are the ones that drive this stuff through. They're just as important to a planning operation as good assumptions for your business plan. Assessing community resources, we'll talk about that. Let's just go to the next slide in case I'm running out of time. There we go. All right, evaluating your options. So, Scott talked a little bit about technology, as did I. We talked a bit about connections. And now in the next couple of slides, we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about what that actually means. We also want to talk about digital inclusion. You know, as I mentioned, it's one thing to have a wonderful broadband network, but we want to have people using it to enhance their life. That's important. And, you know, drawing down movies quickly, excellent, fine. But working from home, making that easier, particularly as we know in this age of COVID-19, that's become really important for people. Just like distance learning has become important, just like telemedicine has become more important. You know, this virus has been horrible. The one thing it has made every community look at is better broadband, because the schools are often not capable, particularly in rural America. In a lot of rural America, as you well know, hospitals have been closing, clinics have been closing, which makes telemedicine all the more important and vital. Next slide, please. All right technology. Again, a couple of issues. One is the technology. Is it some sort of wireless? Is it some sort of hard wire? Scott mentioned a number of cable systems that are using coax cable. A great many cable systems in the country are called hybrid. They've been putting in fiber more and more into the neighborhoods, but from the node, it goes coax to the home. So those systems have been upgraded. Some of them have actually been rebuilt. A lot of those systems are quite capable of providing excellent broadband service. And connections, last mile or middle mile. Those are different kinds of networks, and Scott talked a little bit about that. The issue mainly is what's the right fit for your community. That's going to be based on objectives and needs. Is it difficult terrain? For example, you have a project in California in the Sierras. It's not a giant system, but they're going to go through solid rock for quite a while. That increases the cost exponentially because the terrain is different. One of my projects in Coney, South Carolina, they hit rock all the time, and that increased the cost dramatically. Are there existing providers that would consider building out the last mile if you put in a middle mile? So you put in a minor backbone, middle mile, but then you lease out that space to providers who are going to make the connectivity to the premise or the residential unit. And that gets you off the hook of marketing, gets you off the hook of maintenance, it gets you off many operational hooks that the providers are already good at. Next slide, please. Organizational models. There are lots of different kinds of models in each one of these major categories. We have worked with all of them. Again, one of the things we need to look at right away is what state law and regulation allows, what the benefits are for each one of these, what the legal relationships are, as I mentioned, what are the funding sources, who's going to own the assets, and what kind of expertise is going to be needed. Does the community itself have expertise to run a system or not? So we're going to talk about those in the planning process. Next slide, please. P3s, public-private partnerships. You know, I've worked with a number of potential public-private partnerships. They should be working better than they often are. Part of the issue with public-private partnerships is they often want to go where there's already good connectivity. And that's because there's already a lot of population density. In rural America, one of the reasons you don't have good broadband is because people can't figure out how to make money running the network. So P3s, hopefully, with enough planning opportunity and a community bringing enough to the table, will be able to engage in cost sharing, expertise and support, and institutional collaboration. Remember, the parts of P3 is you're dividing up risks and you're dividing up rewards. So the result of a successful P3 is a contract. We can talk about that in another session. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the most popular P3 models is private sector led. The commercial operator builds it, owns it, operates the network. What the community does is offer monetary and regulatory support. So you get the network, but you don't have to operate it. That works for some communities. Other communities look at it this way. The government or a nonprofit is going to lead it. We're going to own it. Private partners build it, and they operate it. And then we share the revenue. Pardon me, I've got allergies. Lastly, joint ownership model. There are a few of these around. Usually they work so the private partner runs the system and pretty much gets all of the revenue for a certain number of years. But at some point, they give back the ownership to a public or nonprofit. So these are all different strategies. We can go over some of the differences and how to work these in the future. Next slide, please. All right, project plans. So these are vitally important. And these will also become important when you're applying for grants. And we're going to go over some of these as we go through this. We need information that's operational and financial models. We need the resources, and we need to know the benefits to the community and the partners. So in the program description, we need goals, organizational structure. We need to know who's leading it personally. And we also need to know who's going to be managing it. Similarly, with operations, we need to know who's going to actually be operating it and what their experience is. And most importantly, what's the financial situation? And for that, we're going to need balance sheets, income statements, and pro forma. And in a future session, Scott's going to give a little lead off at the end of my presentation about what we're going to do in the future in terms of financial planning, from business planning for the system. Next slide. All right, so what you want to do as a community is get the vision and goals straight, look at the possibilities for organizational structure. Don't pick one right away. See what all of them look like for your community. And then what kinds of products and services you want to be offering. What's the operations going to look like? And again, the importance of your financial statements. All of these things are going to be vital for a network you put together, or for a public-private partnership, or for grants or loans that you apply for. All of these things are going to be vital and quite important.